Haunted houses, ghosts, vampires, demons, and hellhounds. That's what I've been reading for Halloween. So for the month of October, a lot of people on YouTube do this thing called Victober, where they read at least one Victorian classic. So what I thought I'd do this month is read the spooky classics, because of course October is also spooky month. So what I'm going to do is talk to you about 4 books I've just read this month, which are all spooky, all set in the Victorian period, written in the Victorian period. And I think I'm going to talk about them in order of how scary I found them, from least scary to most scary. But they were all wonderful reads. If you're looking for a spooky book, a classic, these are great. Some of them you'll probably have heard of, but you might not necessarily have read. At least 3 of these books will be ones where I think we all feel like we know the story, but you might not necessarily have read the original. 2 of these were completely new reads for me, and although I thought I knew the stories, actually there was lots of stuff that I didn't know and that was completely new to me about these really beloved characters. So I'm going to take you through them. One of these books as well was the scariest thing I have ever read in my life, classic or otherwise. I'll be talking about that one last. So the least scary, but still an absolutely fantastic read, was The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sherlock Holmes. I'm sure most of you will know who Sherlock Holmes is. He's a very famous detective. He lives on 112B, I think, Baker Street, with his sidekick, Dr. Watson. And you mostly come across Sherlock Holmes in a very big collection of short stories written by Arthur Conan Doyle, and also in 4 shorter novels. I'd say the other 3 were more novellas. Hound of the Baskervilles is the longest standalone story. It's about 167 pages in the Wordsworth Classic Edition, so it's definitely a novel, but quite a short one. It was actually published in the Strand in 1901 to 1902, so it's sort of just past the Victorian period and going into Edwardian. Still kind of counts as a Victorian classic, I think, because we first introduced to Sherlock Holmes in the Victorian period. And funnily enough, Arthur Conan Doyle published The Hound of the Baskervilles after he'd already killed off Sherlock Holmes in a short story called The Final Solution, because Conan Doyle had apparently had enough of writing about him. Sherlock Holmes wasn't his favourite creation, even though he's by far now his most famous. And he brought Sherlock Holmes back because he'd already had half of the plot for The Hound of Baskervilles and realised that it would only really suit his already very famous detective. And then this was received so well by the public and by Sherlock Holmes fans that Arthur Conan Doyle brought Sherlock Holmes back for 3 more collections of short stories and 1 final novella. The Hound of the Baskervilles, out of the 4 longer stories, I think The Hound of the Baskervilles is by far the best, and I think most critics would agree with me on that. So The Hound of the Baskervilles, basically Sherlock Holmes, you'll probably be aware, prides himself on his rationality. He's a man of science. He detects by deduction. He looks at the facts, he pieces them together. So when a prospective client turns up at 112B Baker Street talking about generational curses and hellhounds, Holmes isn't particularly impressed, although he is intrigued. So he sends Dr. Watson on his own, first of all, off up to Dartmoor in Devon to investigate. And probably the scariest thing about this book is the setting. Conan Doyle describes Dartmoor so well that it becomes almost a character in itself. The atmosphere, it's so eerie, it's so evocative. It's an absolutely brilliant book for a spooky atmosphere, a spooky setting. And then when Watson gets there, there's lots of also little subplots he's investigating. There's strange lights on the moors. He thinks he can hear the hellhound howling. There's strange goings on in the house that he's staying in. He meets some very strange and quite creepy characters from the local area. There's quite a lot going on. So I won't spoil the ending for you. I will tell you that Sherlock Holmes is satisfied by it. So is The Hellhound really a hellhound? But it's a brilliant book. It's quite fast-paced, especially for a Victorian novel. It's brilliantly plotted. And I think Sherlock Holmes, although I normally prefer Holmes in the shorter stories, I think he's fantastic in this one. We get some great characterization. Dr. Watson features very heavily. He's not just a kind of bystander in this. He's very much an active agent, and so it's great to see more of him as well. And so I would say this is spooky. rather than scary. It's got a lot of spooky vibes, but absolutely fantastic read. This was a reread for me, and I think I loved it even more, even though I knew the ending. It's a fantastic read. The second book is Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Now, this was brilliant. This was a first read for me. It was one where I felt like I know this story. I've seen the film. It's referenced so many times in other works by many critics. I kind of felt like I knew the story and wondered whether I'd particularly enjoy it. It's quite a short book. I think around 170 pages, about the same sort of length as Hound of the Baskervilles. So this was published in 1891. It was first serialised in Lippincott's in America in a shorter version because there was so much controversy stirred up by this book that they had to bring it to a quick end. Many people felt that this book was immoral, that it promoted decadence and hedonism and sin and even quite devilish, demonic vibes. And so I think it was actually banned for a short time in certain places. But it's a fantastic book. If you're not familiar with the story, Dorian Gray is a young man. He's around 20 when we first meet him. He's incredibly handsome, incredibly beautiful. He looks like an angel. And he has these two older friends. One is Basil, who does a beautiful portrait of him. And Basil is a good guy. He's considered to be a bit of a straight edge by others. He's quite respectable. He's got a conscience. He tries to do good in the world. His friend, Dorian's other friend, Henry, is the complete opposite. Henry is a complete hedonist. He just wants to live his life for pleasure and do what he wants. And he's always he becomes a corrupting influence on Dorian. He's always kind of leading him down the wrong path. Interestingly, though, Henry doesn't actually, apart from being kind of a pleasure seeker, he doesn't ever seem to do anything that's that bad. He talks a good game, but he doesn't necessarily actually act on it. But he unfortunately becomes this really corrupting influence on Dorian. And we see Dorian go from this kind of vain, kind of selfish, but he's a young guy, to just this figure of incredible evil, but very, very much a human evil. So what Dorian does, he realizes that his looks and his beauty are giving him just a bit of a leg up in life, and he doesn't want to lose them. Right, they're his thing. That's what he's got. And so he kind of sells his soul so that he can keep his looks, his handsomeness, his angelic visage, and he does. But what happens is, as Dorian ages and we see his kind of moral corruption, he falls deeper and deeper into, so when we say evil, we go from kind of hanging around in brothels and opium dens, corrupting other people, to flat out murder. So Dorian gets pretty bad. And while he's doing all of this, he remains looking as youthful and as angelic as ever. But the painting that Basil painted of him shows up all of that corruption and all of that evil. So the painting doesn't just age, it also looks frightening. It sort of looks cruel, and it describes it as having this sort of kind of evil smile. And at one point, the painting even has blood on its hands. Dorian has to lock this painting away. He's obsessed by it and terrified of anyone finding it. And the ending to this, I think, was definitely scary in that kind of real gothic horror kind of way. So although this is a book very much about human evil, apart from the kind of nod to a sort of selling the soul pact with the devil, although the devil never actually turns up in the book, that's kind of what it's hinting at. It's very much about human evil, and it also, I think, this book really makes you think. It's quite interesting because in the preface, so Wilde writes about how, perhaps as a pushback to critics who had kind of slammed it for being immoral, he writes about how it's just art. Art cannot be immoral or moral, it's just art. And yet, you cannot not read the moral in this tale. And as I don't know if Oscar Wilde was kind of dodge criticism or was just trolling his critics, I don't know. Or whether he really did try and write what is clearly a morally heavy novel, but as a piece of art. I'm not sure what Wilde was up to. I don't know a huge amount about him as a figure. This is wonderfully written. Wilde's writing is beautiful, and it really does make you think and think deeply. There's quite a lot of philosophy in here and musing. It's light, it's quite a pacey short book, but it does get you thinking deeply just about the nature of evil, the nature of humanity, what is the purpose of life. It's a real good book. It had a really deep impact on me and definitely eerie vibes. And then the third is Bram Stoker's Dracula. I feel like everyone has heard of this, even if they haven't read it. Now, I did read this many, many, many years ago. I think I was still very young. Didn't remember a huge amount about it. And I think because I don't even think I was a teenager, I'd read an abridged version. This is probably the first time I've read the full novel. And it was great. Again, it was one of them where I felt like, well, I knew the story, there's going to be no surprises, but actually there's so many subtleties and complexities to the plot of Dracula that I haven't seen in any of the films. And it was just such a great read. It's told in an epistolary form, which means it's told in letters, journal entries, even newspaper articles, which is great because you get to see the story through the eyes of all of the different main characters and even of the community. And you really get to see the impact that Dracula and his evil has on lots of different people. This was published in 1897. I think Bram Stoker actually wrote about 10 novels. This is probably the only one that's really well known, and it's definitely his best. The writing in it is beautiful. Dracula is a genuinely frightening figure. It starts off, the first few chapters follow a lawyer called Jonathan Harker who goes to Transylvania to visit Count Dracula to help him with some real estate problems, and he gets a lot more than he's bargaining for. It's deliciously gothic. You've got this huge crumbling castle on top of a cliff. We've got the vampire brides. We've got, people being eaten. It's definitely scary. All of the traditional horror vibes. It then switches to London, so we don't know what's happened to Jonathan. The last time we meet him, he's been locked up by Dracula, ready to become dinner for Dracula's vampire brides. And we then switch to England, and Dracula is coming to England to set up over here and have all these new people to prey upon. As well as being a frightening book, though, it's also quite fun. We get this kind of band of heroic males who go off to face down Dracula, and I don't think Bram Stoker meant that to be slightly farcical and campy, but it sort of is, and there's a lot of gushing over how wonderfully heroic these males are, that just, to read it today, is funny. Having said that, though, the main female character, Mina, I would say is a proto-feminist character. She wants to work. She's got a lot of skills. I'd say she definitely wears the trousers in her marriage, but not in a kind of comedical way of the bossy wife or anything like that. She just kind of is the stronger one of the Harkers. She's Jonathan Harker's wife. She has a lot of agency. She makes her own decisions. She's definitely a great female character, particularly for the Victorian period, where I feel like female characters don't always come off very well. So this is a fantastic book. The only thing I would say about this is, whereas all of the other books I think have really good endings, I feel like the ending to this one is quite dragged out and becomes a little bit anticlimactic. I feel like the first half of this book is scarier than the second, but it's definitely a good read. It's about 300 pages, so a nice length, not too short, but not a really long one either. And I absolutely ate this up. It was really immersive. It really pulled me in. It was a fantastic read. And of course, it's just a brilliant one for the run up to Halloween. The fourth book, and the one that I found the scariest, and the one that actually I think is the scariest thing I've ever read. And I've read a lot of horror. I've read most of the kind of classic horror. I've read The Exorcist. I've read The Omen. I read Stephen King. I read Grady Hendrix. I read all the psychological thrillers. I read quite a lot of scary stuff. I've never read anything this frightening, and it's The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, and this was published in 1898. And it's quite short, so there's two stories in this. It's only about 100 pages long, so it's more of a novella. And it follows this quite kind of repressed, religious young woman who becomes a governess. She goes to Bly Manor to look after these two children, a boy who's around 10, a girl who's around 8. Their uncle who looks after them is in the city, so there's just her in the house and a couple of the servants and a female housekeeper who she befriends. And it's kind of her in charge looking after these children and their education. It's kind of a big secret around why the boy Miles isn't in school. But she thinks that these children are just angelic. They're beautiful children. They look like little angels. They're incredibly well behaved. She thinks they're absolutely angelic. But then things start to happen. She starts to see ghosts. There are rumours. There are murders in the village. She finds out about the disappearance of potential murder of their previous governess, and she starts to wonder if these children are not so much angelic as demonic. And you're never sure in this book whether the ghosts are real or whether the governess is going insane, or both. So you're in the governess's point of view. And it kind of gets more ambiguous as it goes on, and it's that very ambiguity that makes it frightening. The ending is incredibly abrupt and terrifying. I finished this and I just sat and stared at the book for about 5 minutes, like, what did I just read? And it stayed with me for days. I kept thinking about this book. It really creeped me out. I had really creepy dreams the night after I read it. I think that the turn of the screw refers to how the story kind of gradually tightens itself around you. You become more and more wrapped up in it, and each turn of the screw, each event is more frightening than the last, and it kind of inexorably draws towards this really, really terrifying ending. And whichever way you read this, whether you read it as human evil, as demonic evil, or a mixture of both, each scenario that you each answer that you come up with feels scarier than the last. Apparently, the legend goes that when Henry James had to reread this book for the editing process, he scared himself with it so much that he couldn't go to sleep that night. I think that's probably a testament. I think if an author is terrified of his own work, then it's a scary work. This is a story I will be thinking about for quite a long time. I'll probably never reread it. It was fantastic. I think it's a work of genius, but I don't ever want to be that scared by a book again. So they were my 4 spooky classics of October. If you haven't read any of them, I really hope you'll pick a couple of them up and give them a go. I had so much fun this month reading them. I think I'm going to finish off the month, although it's not a Victorian classic, I kind of want to keep the spooky classic theme going, so I'm probably going to give Frankenstein a reread. So have a happy Halloween and happy spooky reading.